The reason that everyone's got very tight about this announcement is that we are essentially seeing the end of the destroyer. It's a bit like seeing the end of a ship of the line, a sailing ship of the line. It's almost incomprehensible because as an entity, it's been the backbone of our fleet for decades, if not centuries. So there's a real sort of concern about the philosophy behind it. The reality is this: the next generation of destroyer or cruiser, let's say the Type 83, which would have been a cruiser, which is essentially a posh word for very expensive, very large destroyer, would have cost somewhere in the region of £3 billion each. Type 45 was £1 billion each. The Type 83 would have been roughly £2 to £4 billion each. So phenomenally expensive. And the reality of the world in which we live is that that money would not have been made available. So we were ended up with far too few. And then there's a reality to combat operations now in an environment where every person has thousands of drones. If you look at the Strait of Hormuz, if you look at the Black Sea, if you look at the Bab el-Mandeb in the southern Red Sea, very large, very exquisite platforms with everything in it is not the future. That is obvious. Dispersed lethality is a good solution to this problem. So there's two parts to this. The first is we didn't have the money to replace them anyway. Now that's defeatist. I concede that. And it annoys me because we should have the money. But in a reality where we don't, then a good solution is to disaggregate. So rather than having 4 £3 billion warships, you have 6 of these common combat vessels, and then they each have 4 different types of, let's call them sloops for now, associated with them that are either very low crewed, very lean crewed, or totally autonomous. So you've gone from 4 multi-billion pound ships to a variety of dispersed assets. Now, there are a huge number of technical and shipbuilding and industrial hurdles to cross before we get to that vision. And here's the problem, and I think this may be the top line in all of this, is that requires money. And I can absolutely guarantee, because I've been around this boy a few times, that money will not be allocated. In other words, it's a good vision being forced upon the Navy, but could work, but won't, because it won't be properly resourced. And I think we'll find that out tomorrow. Just to expand slightly on what this common core vessel could look like, if I was a betting man, I would say it'll look very much like the Type 31s that we're already producing, that Babcock are already building up in Rosyth. And the reason I say that is because we need to do this quickly. We need to do it cheaply. And nothing saves money more than having already made those mistakes. When a new yard builds a new warship, there are mistakes made along the way. Of course there are, like any new product. And we've gone through that learning process with the Type 31 up in Rosyth already. Now, the Navy's only ordered 5 of those. It's not enough. We need more. We need them to backfill the tasks that our patrol vessels are currently doing. So, and Babcock needs the orders, because once the Type 31 has stopped, its order book starts to look a bit bare. So it wouldn't surprise me, and it would make a lot of sense, if the CCV, when it first comes out, looks very much like a slightly modified, slightly different Type 31. And that's really efficient. That's really efficient. It's really sensible. And then again, it gives Babcock certainty and numbers, and then we can start properly exporting that hull and fulfilling its potential. So I think that's an exciting part of this too. In a perfect world, you'd have both. You would have a dozen Type 83s, each with 96 missile silos and a massive radar on top and doing all that good stuff. I mean, just a side thing on the radar, this is what drives the size of destroyers, the requirement to have a large, very powerful radar as high up in the ship as you can get it. It's why the Type 45 was the size they are, because the Samson radar, the big ball, that weighs 8 tons. So you put that at the top of the main mast, you've now got to essentially kind of create a hull around that. But that assumption is going away. Technology is changing that assumption. There are now other ways to track, and a lot of them involve passive systems, i.e. you're not transmitting power anymore, you're receiving signals. It's very technical, but the bottom line is these things don't need to be huge, and therefore you can have lots of them on your disaggregated sloops. So you can compensate for the lack of this large radar. But yes, in a perfect world, you'd have both. You'd have massive destroyers, you'd have cruisers, you'd have sloops, all operating on the sort of meshed network. But that isn't the reality we're facing. And you still can't get away from the fact that the single large destroyer in the middle of all of this, once they've fired all their missiles, then what? They have to go somewhere miles away. The Red Sea taught us that. Diamond had to go up through Suez and all the way to Gibraltar and back. The Americans are working very hard at trying to work on how to do this at sea, how to reload missiles at sea. But in the meantime, a version where there are many more smaller pickets with, let's say, 30 missiles each, 32 missiles each, makes more sense because you can rotate one of them out to reload and then bring the other one in. Now, I'm playing whiteboard navies here. I'm plotting what perfect looks like at the end of all this. We mustn't get away from the fact that between this vision and the reality of delivering it are some huge hurdles, cultural, industrial, and like I say, financial. And it's the finance one that really worries me in all of this. Well, interestingly, undersea cables, of course, you're into the frigate domain here. Frigate's core role in Royal Navy terms has always been anti-submarine warfare, whereas destroyers have always been anti-air warfare. Different navies blur those lines, and I think we're about to start doing that because as sensors get better, as I say, if you can put a destroyer's worth of sensors on a frigate, then what's the difference anymore? But we are building the Type 26 frigate. I mean, it's painfully slow. It was delayed. It's why the Type 23s are now old and decrepit. Bless them, but the Type 26 is coming. So we will retain this large billion-pound warship, 1.2, I think they come in at roughly, to do anti-submarine warfare. So when it comes to critical undersea infrastructure, now you're really looking at Atlantic Bastion and that series of defensive measures, of which the sloops, the Type 93 is going to be the extra large undersea vehicle. It will be a key part of it. The Type 94, which is going to be the sensor sloop, that will definitely be part of it. 4 of those across the Bear Gap, which is the gap to the northeast of the Greenland Iceland UK Gap, and is essentially the front door for Russian submarine activity. You've got the Bear Gap and the Greenland Iceland UK Gap, and you need to dominate that. So Bastion needs to poke its way a long way up to northeast, and the Type 94 sensor ship could, you wouldn't need too many of those to dominate that gap. Then you put a couple of Type 26s up there, and suddenly you're looking quite good. And then if we've got genuinely, I hate the word, but attritable, i.e. disposable undersea sensors that you can launch from your Type 26, or you can launch from your Type 94, however we configure it, and you can put these things away by the thousand, you can, on a whiteboard, start looking like you've got a very, very good solution. And the reason I say on a whiteboard and with a little bit of a smirk is because being at sea is very, very challenging. So everything I've just described, imagine doing that in the high north in the middle of winter in a Sea State 7, where you can barely walk around a 6,000-ton warship. And now we're talking about doing it on smaller, minimally crewed this is going to be very, very challenging. And from a maintenance perspective as well, we're going to have to make these things, these sloops, and to extent the common core vessel, we're going to have to make them very, very well, because every ship I was ever at sea in had an engineering department of about 60 or 70 people, more like 150 in the aircraft carrier, and they were busy fixing stuff all the time because things at sea break all the time. If you're going to make small vessels that are going to get battered, you're going to make them well enough to not break all the time, you're going to have to make them very, very well with a different philosophy. And then, of course, all the while you were eroding into the cost savings that you thought you were going to have over the exquisite, expensive cruises in the first place. So it's a multifaceted thing. It's not as simple as saying the end of destroyers is a disaster. It's also not as simple as Defense Secretary saying, we've got the solution to Russian activity, out of area activity. It's going to be a mix of both. But coming back to my main point here, all of this needs funding. Every navy that's working on similar sums, of which France are slightly less than us, but get much better value for money. Germany a bit less still. We're all coming across the same problem, which is the cost of these long-range, 50-year exquisite warships that take 10, 15, 20 years to build. And then everyone looks at it and goes, is that going to be the answer in 50 years' time? And you look at the rate of technology and go, probably not. So everyone is scratching their heads. And this is a really important point because we've gone ugly early, as we used to say, on this hybrid concept. And I suspect, in fact, I know there will be a lot of countries in Europe and in the Nordics and in the Baltics looking very closely at this. And if we get it right, the export value could be massive. This could, optimism bias aside, take us into a really positive space for exports, because we may be about to provide the answer to what is becoming, as you've just said, a very difficult problem for a number of navies.